We're going to switch gears. We're bringing in now Dr. Hua Gong. Dr. Gong has joined the Department of Sport Management just this past year. He teaches many of our analytics classes. He is a graduate from the University of South Carolina, born and raised in China. We are thrilled to have him as a member of our faculty. He's done a great job, great researcher, great teacher, and the students love him. So at this time, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Hua Gong.
Thank you, Clark. Let me share my screen here. Thank you, guys. Thank you for joining this lecture. So for my lecture today, I want to talk about one of my recent studies, which is about the referee bias in the NBA, evidence from the games during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I prepared three things to talk about for today's lecture. The first one, I want to talk about some of the existing research on referee bias. And I want to talk about the exploratory analysis of the NBA last 2-minute reports, which is a data set I will be using for the analysis in today's lecture. The third thing I want to talk about today is to share with you some of my research findings related to the crowd effect on referee bias in the NBA by using a lot of games, NBA games played during the COVID-19 era. So first, some existing research on referee bias. And I think overall speaking that the referee bias is actually a very, very interesting and very controversial topic in sports. And the first thing we have to know about referees is that the referees are appointed to make unbiased judgment. So we expect that, generally speaking, the referees are going to make those unbiased decisions on the court, on the field. But we all know that in sports, referees may sometimes make biased decisions to favor the home team. And this is the referee bias that I will talk about for today's lectures. That is, referees are trying to favor home teams over away team. So those kind of favoritisms is often considered a source of home advantage. People believe that because referees, generally speaking, may favor home teams, that's why the home teams will have a lot of advantage over their opponents. And this actually is true in a lot of settings because a lot of research in the past have shown that strong evidence of referee bias towards the home team. For example, if we can take a look at some of studies related to the European football leagues, we find that some studies show that there's going to be more allowance for time lost or stoppage time for home teams in a lot of European football league games. And it could be a lot of penalty kicks are more likely to be awarded to home teams. So this is another way the referees is favoring home teams over away teams in European football leagues. Or a lot of referees give more yellow card or red card to away teams. This is another way that referees are in favor of home teams in European football leagues. Moving to the NBA, there is a very, very controversial study in 2012 published by Price, Remmer, and Stone, and they're looking at very interesting stuff in the NBA. They're looking at two different kinds of turnovers. One is called discretionary turnovers. The other one is called non-discretionary turnovers. So for this discretionary turnovers, for example, the travel, 3 seconds, offensive goaltend, and offensive foul, for those kind of turnovers, it involves a lot of referee's judgment. Whereas on the other hand, we have some non-discretionary turnovers. Those things are not related to the referee's judgment. So for example, the bad pass, lost ball, or shot clock, those things are not usually involve a lot of referee's judgment. So this study shows that the referees actually favor home teams by calling more discretionary turnovers on away teams. And they use this non-discretionary turnovers to control for the player's effort in a given match. So far we talked a little bit about the referee bias towards the home teams in a lot of sports settings, I think a more interesting question to think about or to discuss here is the causes of the referee bias towards the home teams. That is why the referees are going to favor home teams over away team. Well, there's some of the possibilities here. For example, some studies have shown that the stake size is possible one reason. There's some studies showed that in some critical match or critical competition, for example, if teams are playing for a playoff spot or if they're competing for the first place in conference, those kind of competition may be the referees are more likely to favor home teams over away team. The second possibility is heterogeneities in referees. Possibly some referees are more likely to in favor of home teams over other over other teams. Maybe some referees are because they received very, very strong training, so they eliminated those kind of referee bias towards the home teams. But the most common belief about this referee bias towards home team is that there's going to be social pressures from fans in the stands, because if you play in a games, those home fans may be cheering very, very loud. They may pointing at the referees, they may yelling at the referees. So referees may feel a lot of pressures, and they may subconsciously make those kind of very, very biased decisions in favor of the home teams. And that's something I am trying to figure out for today's lecture within the context of NBA. I want to see whether the social pressure, whether the crowd is a factor that led to the referee bias in the NBA. So to study that, actually, we needed to have some data points where the referees is officiating games in empty stadiums. And then we can compare how referees are performing versus the game where the referees is officiating games in a regular arena. But as we all know, for a lot of NBA games, we don't expect there will be zero attendance for many, many NBA games. But right now, because of the COVID-19, because of this pandemic, actually many, many professional sports leagues across the US ban fans from attending the live events. So this has actually created opportunities to study how those kind of absence of fans will eventually influence referees' decisions towards the home team. So actually, since the COVID-19, there have been there have been a lot of study published trying to study the crowd effect on referee bias towards home team in European football leagues. So for example, here I cited 6 different studies coming right after the closed game in a lot of European football leagues. And if you're looking at the last column of this table here, the most common theme you see here is that a lot of studies have shown there is drop in referee bias when teams are played in those kind of empty stadiums. So my study here is a little bit different from previous studies because I am using this very, very special data set coming from the NBA last 2 minutes reports. So I want to use the data from this NBA last 2 minute report to investigate whether the absence of fans will affect referee bias towards the home team in the NBA. To study those kind of things, how the crowd is going to affect the referee bias, I think one of the main challenges here is to really disentangle referee and player behavior. Because if the teams play in empty arenas, those kind of environment will also affect the player behaviors. Players probably become less aggressive in those kind of environment. There's no fans cheering for them. They're probably going to be playing very, very conservative under those kind of conditions. So to study how the crowd is going to affect the referees, we have to find a way to disentangle referee and player behavior in this case. So a lot of the previous research compares foul call differences between the home team and away team with or without fans to study those kind of crowd effect on referee bias. And those differences here may be caused by the change in player behavior rather than the change in referee bias. So it is very, very important for for us to disentangle the referee and player behavior to really understand how the crowd is going to affect the referee bias towards the home team. So the great things about this NBA last 2 minutes reports data is that this NBA report does not only count the quantity of foul calls, but also the accuracy of foul calls and non-calls. And this is a really, really great data set because think about it, if we see that referees becomes less likely to make incorrect calls on away teams when there's nobody watching from the stands, probably that is some sort of signal showing that referee bias is reduced when nobody is watching in the stands. And also from this kind of cases, I assume that the accuracy of a foul call or non-call does not depend on the player's effort. So here I assume even though players playing very, very hard, I expect that the referees are going to make those calls, foul calls or non-calls at the same level as before. So those kind of assumption and combined with the NBA last 2 minute reports really isolate the referee's behavior from the player behavior and allowed me to test how the crowd is going to affect the referee behaviors in the NBA. So before I share with you my data analysis results, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about this, the NBA last 2 minute reports, which is a very, very interesting data set here. So this is a typical NBA last 2 minute reports you're going to see from the NBA website. It has a lot of detailed information on this report. And before we get into the details of the report, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about what is actually this NBA last 2 minute report. So the NBA last 2 minute report is a play-by-play report regarding all calls and the material non-calls in the last 2 minutes of the fourth quarter or the last 2 minutes of any overtime period for all games that meet designated criteria. So it only reports only looking at the last 2 minutes of the fourth quarter or the last 2 minutes of the overtime in qualified games. So what kind of games will be qualified for have those kind of last 2 minute reports? So effective with 2017-2018 season, L2M will be done for any game in which one team's lead over the other is 3 points or fewer at any point during the last 2 minutes of the fourth quarter or overtime. So whenever we see those kind of games is happening, the NBA is going to do a report, those kind of last 2 minutes report on those kind of games. So there's a lot of information actually we can draw from this kind of report. So for example, here I have example of this last 2 minute reports, and this is a game between the Celtics and Trailblazer. This game took place on April 13, 2021. And we can take a look at some of the examples on this report here. For example, if we're looking at this particular cell, and for this particular play, it tells you what kind of call is it. It's supposed to be offensive foul, and there is some committing players. This play involves Jason Tatum and involves the Norman Powell. And this is review decision for this particular play is CNC, which stands for the correct non-call. So we can also see some detailed information about this particular play. For example, for this one, we're seeing Tatum release from the contact with Powell off ball as he attempts to get open. So the reason the NBA labeled as correct non-call is because this is not a foul. And the referees did not call below the whistle and call any foul on this particular play. So they regarded this as correct non-call. On the other hand, if we look at another example in this report here, for this play, it's also an offensive foul. And Jaylen Brown, the players involved Jaylen Brown and Damian Lillard, and the NBA is labeled as INC, which stands for the incorrect non-call. So for this kind of plays, you can see the comments here. The Brown dislodges Lillard from his legal guarding position as he makes the pass. So this is supposed to be an offensive foul on the Jaylen Brown, but the referees failed to below the whistle to call this as an offensive foul. That's why they label this particular play as incorrect non-calls. So for any NBA last 2 minutes reports, there are 4 different kinds of labels. First one is about incorrect calls versus a correct calls. So for those kind of situation, if the referee is below the whistle and it called a foul, it's either going to be incorrect foul call or correct foul call. In other cases, they're going to have incorrect non-calls and a correct non-calls. So for example, if there is a foul, but the referees failed to blow the whistle and call this as a foul, this will be considered as incorrect non-calls. For the correct non-calls, as I explained before, it's happening when there is no foul on the floor and the referees did not blow the whistle to call the foul. So those kind of actions will be considered as correct non-calls. So there are 4 different kind of labels we can find from the NBA last 2 minutes reports. So going back to the referee bias towards home team we're talking about here, the referees can actually favor home teams through making more incorrect calls on away teams or more incorrect non-calls on home teams. So they can just call a lot of incorrect calls on away teams as a way to favor home teams, or they can simply help home teams to avoid a lot of foul calls. They can make those incorrect non-calls on home teams as a way to help home teams or favor home teams over away teams. So if we do a very quick summary statistics on this foul calls and non-calls in the NBA last 2 minute reports, we can see actually a lot of great information here. For example, if you're paying attention to the IC per period in 2021 season here, we can see that the IC per period in 2021 is close to 0.167. So that means probably every 5 periods we can expect there's going to be 1 incorrect call here. And if looking at the IC percentage here is close to 5%. So that means every 20 foul calls in NBA, we can expect there's going to be 1 incorrect calls. Moving to the right side of the table, we can take a look at some incorrect non-call per period. So for incorrect non-call per period, the number is close to 0.571 in 2020-2021 season. And that means probably for every 2 games, there's going to be 1, every 2 periods, there's going to be 1 incorrect non-calls. And if we're looking at INC percentage here, we can expect maybe every 23, 24 non-calls, there are going to be 1 incorrect non-calls. So that's sort of the frequency of the incorrect calls or non-correct calls you can expect from the NBA last 2 minute reports here. So if we visualize those kind of data over time, we can see if we're looking at this incorrect calls, we can actually see that NBA is actually getting worse over time, because if we're looking at the data from 2017 or 2018, there's close 3% chance that we can see incorrect calls in the last 2 minute reports. And this number has risen to close to 5% in 2020-21 season, where actually there are a lot of empty games happened in this season. Moving to the graph on the right side of the screen here, we can see that for the incorrect non-calls, this number is actually getting a little bit better in NBA. If we take a look at a number in 2018, there's 6% chance we're going to see an incorrect non-call, and this number drops to close to 4.4% in 2021 season in NBA. So it seems like the incorrect non-call is getting better and in the NBA. So we can also, looking at those percentage of incorrect calls by home teams and away teams, and from this graph, we can see there's no clear trend or no clear pattern on which team is more likely to receive incorrect calls. We don't see that. For some years, for example, 2018, seems like the home teams is more likely to receive incorrect calls, but other years, 2019, 20 years, it seems like away teams are more likely to receive those kind of incorrect calls. And if we're looking at the graph on the right side here, we can see that, again, there is no clear pattern on which teams are more likely to receive incorrect non-call. For example, some years, 2019, we see that home teams are more likely to receive those kind of incorrect non-call, but going into year 2020 season and 2021 season, we see that, in fact, away teams are more likely to receive those kind of incorrect non-calls. So far we talked about the NBA last 2 minute reports. Hopefully you get a little bit idea of what the data looks like. Now I want to move it to the third part of my lecture, which is talking about, I want to share with you some of my findings related to the crowd effect on NBA referee bias by using the games played in the COVID-19 era here. So the data I will use for this analysis is the data from the 2017-2018 to 2020-21 seasons. The reason I use this data from this period of time because the NBA actually did a lot of change on the NBA last two minute reports at the beginning of the 2017-2018 seasons. In order to make sure that I have consistent data over time, I decided to ditch the data before the 2017-2018 season and use the data after 2017-2018 season here. And I also use 3 different models, linear probability models, differences in difference estimators, and a Poisson model to figure out whether the crowd is going to affect the referee bias in NBA. So let's talk about the first model here, linear probability model. So for this model, I use a full data set from the 2017-2018 to 2021 season. That involves about 1,548 games with 186 games in empty arenas. And also from this data set, we have about 5,570 foul calls and 23,706 non-calls. And I use this linear probability model here to study how the crowd is going to affect the referee bias in the NBA. So for this equation here, we have y here, yIGT, which is equal to 1 if referee makes an incorrect call or incorrect non-call on team I in play J and game T and 0 otherwise. So I have 2 different models here, one for foul calls and the other one for non-foul calls. And moving to the right side of the equation, we have some key variables I want to talk about here. The first one is home. This one will be equal to 1 if team I is played at home and 0 otherwise. And empty here is going to equal to 1 if team I is playing in an empty stadium, an empty arena. And this intersection terms allowed us to test when there's no fans in the stands, how does that gonna affect the referee bias in the NBA? So I want to quickly show you the data analysis results here. For the first model, we're looking at the incorrect non-calls versus correct non-calls. So from this model, we can actually see that the estimated variable for empty is statistically significant at 5% and is negative. So this actually means when teams are playing in empty stadiums, referees are less likely to make those kind of incorrect non-calls. And moving to the second variable here, the intersection terms, I find that there is no, this variable is not statistically significant. That means the absence of the fans actually has no impact on how likely the referees are going to make incorrect non-calls on home teams. And moving to the model on the right side here, we see none of the variables here are statistically significant. That means we don't expect that when teams playing in empty stadiums, that's going to have any impact on how likely the referees are going to make incorrect calls on home teams or away teams. So the second model I will be using here is DDD Estimators. For this particular models, I'm using data set from the 2021 season alone, which is the current season. So the current NBA season hasn't finished yet. We still have about 1 month to go for the NBA regular season. So all the data set here I have for this model is as of April 14, 2021. And for this data set, we have 228 games, including 167 games played in empty stadium, empty arenas. And this data set also include about 874 foul calls and 3,391 non-calls. So the reason I only use the 2021 season data is because I have concern that because during the pandemic era, there are a lot of things has changed. And I'm a little bit concerned in my previous model, I may miss some key variables related to the pandemic. And that's why I wanted to use the 2021 season alone to make sure I do not miss major important variables for my model. So this DDD estimator also takes advantage of the fact that over the course of the NBA 2021 season, there are a few teams that never allowed fans in their arena as of April 14, 2021. Whereas for some teams, they allowed fans into their stadiums over the course of 2021 season. So if you're looking at the picture on the screen right now, this picture shows the NBA 2021 season team attendance by game. So on the x-axis here, we have the home game number from 0 to close to 30. And on the y-axis here, we have the team name, NBA team name. And the square here, if the square here has a gray color, that means they never have fans in their arenas. If there is some red color in the squares, that means there's some fans attend this particular game. So as we can see here, at the top of this graph, there are a few teams, they never have fans in their arenas as of April 14, 2021. And there's some teams here that allows their fans enter the arena over the course of 2021 season. And there are 5 teams at the bottom of this graph: the Rockets, Pelicans, Magic, Jazz, and Cavaliers. They always have fans in their arenas starting from the beginning of the season. So from this graph, it actually created opportunity for us to study how the crowd, when there is a crowd in the arena, how does that going to affect the referee bias in the NBA? So the model here I have here is classic setup for DDD estimators. Some of the key variables I want to talk about here is the D here. The D is equal to 1 if team I in the treatment group allow fans in game T and 0 otherwise. And those intersection term, the DIT times the home, allowed me to test when there's a fans in arenas, how does that going to affect the referee bias in the NBA? So here is the estimation results here. As we can see for the model, INC versus CNC here, it's quite interesting in a way that I actually find that the home teams is less likely to receive incorrect non-call compared to the away teams. This is a little bit surprising because if there is referee bias in the NBA, I expect that the home teams are more likely to receive incorrect non-calls. But the data analysis results show that the home teams is actually less likely to receive incorrect non-calls based on the 2021 season data. The D here is statistically significant, meaning that when there's fans in arenas, referees are more likely to make incorrect non-calls. And this intersection term is not statistically significant, meaning that even though the presence of the fans does not make referees more likely to make incorrect non-calls on home teams. The same thing we can find, a very similar results we can find for the IC versus CC model here. We find that when there's fans in the stadium, in arenas, referees are more likely to make incorrect calls, but those presence of the foul call, the presence of the fans does not make the referees become more likely to make incorrect calls on away teams. Going to the third model, the Poisson model, I'm using the same data set here from the 2017, 2018 to 2021 season, and that also involves about 1,548 games. But in this case, I am doing analysis at the game level. The reason I do this analysis is because I have a little bit of concern about the data called the CNC, the correct non-cause. Because if you really think about this particular mark here, the CNC, the correct non-cause, it's actually quite hard to define what kind of actions can be considered as correct non-call. Because if a player is simply standing on the court doing nothing, just moving around doing nothing, basically this kind of actions can be considered as correct non-call, because this player never commit any foul and the referees did not blow the whistle on this particular play. So that's basically a correct non-call. So I was a little bit, unsure how the NBA actually defined the correct non-call in their last 2-minute reports. That's why I wanted to get rid of this correct non-call and purely focusing on the mistakes that referees are making from the NBA last 2-minute reports. So that's what the Poisson model is coming from. And here I did some data visualization, just show you the number of games by the incorrect non-calls and the number of games by incorrect calls. So for example, for the incorrect non-calls, we can see that the distribution is actually quite even. There's about 650 games, there's no incorrect non-calls. There's about 500 games, there's gonna be one incorrect non-calls, and about 269 games, there's 2 incorrect non-calls, and there's 3 games, there's 85 game. There are 85 games, there are 3 incorrect non-calls. Moving to the right side of this graph here, we can see that the majority of the games do not have incorrect calls there. And we see there's about 191 games, there's 1 incorrect call there. So this model is actually quite similar. The setup is quite similar as we had before. On the left side of this equation, we have the YIT here, which is the expected number of incorrect non-calls or incorrect calls for team I in game T. And on the right side of the equations, we have very similar variable, just as we had it before: home, empty, and intersection terms. So from this model, we are getting very similar results as the linear probability model before. And we can see here the estimated coefficient for empty is actually statistically significant and negative. That means when teams are playing in empty stadiums, referees are less likely, or the referees are going to make a fewer incorrect non-calls on teams. And same thing here, we don't find the statistically significant estimators on this interaction terms, meaning that even though there's no fans in arenas, that does not make referees become more likely or less likely to make incorrect non-calls on home teams. Looking at the model here, none of the variable are statistically significant, just as we see before. So based on the 3 models, we can draw some conclusion from this. That is, the first conclusion I want to draw here is there's consistent evidence that the referee bias is unlikely to exist in crunch time in NBA. The second conclusion I want to draw here is NBA referees do not seem to treat home team and away team differently with or without fans. We don't see that home teams are more likely to receive those incorrect calls or incorrect non-calls when there's no fans in arena. The third conclusion I want to draw here is it seems like referees are less likely to make incorrect non-calls when there's no fans in arena. So it seems like the presence of fans does have some influence on referees' performance, but those kind of influence has nothing to do with the referee bias towards the home team. There's some interesting discussions we may draw from this particular studies. The first point I want to make here is, unlike European football leagues, NBA referees do not seem to favor home teams in close games. Some of the research I talked about early on, we see very strong referee bias towards home team in European football leagues, but we don't see those kind of things in the NBA in close games. The second point I want to make here is referees do not contribute to reduce home advantage in empty arenas, because people right now think about, especially during this year, we have this reduced home advantage because a lot of games are without fans, and there's multiple reasons we see that the reduced home advantage. Some people speculate it's probably because referees. Some people maybe speculate it's probably because players play less hard. But from the study we see here, referees actually has nothing to do with reduced home advantage in the NBA for this particular season. So one big question is, why is that? I think there are multiple reasons for that. First of all, I think NBA has very strong programs about their referees, especially the NBA has suffered from this match fixing scandals a lot in the past, particularly with the Team Donaghy case. So they're very careful. NBA is very, very careful about their referees. They want to make sure that they're holding these referees accountable for their behavior on the court. The second reason is that the NBA actually has very transparent referee evaluation system. We see those NBA last two-minute reports. We don't see those kind of things very often in other professional sports league. So because they make things very transparent, we're able to systematically evaluate how referees are performing on the court. The third reason probably is that the NBA has a very, very strong referee training program. So they provide strong training to referees, and this allowed referees to get better trainings. Maybe they're able to eliminate those kind of unnecessary bias against away teams in a competition. So last part I wanted to mention here is some of the limitation of my studies, because my study only looking at some games are qualified for NBA last two-minute reports. So not all games are considered. And only the last 2 minutes of the fourth quarter and overtime in close games are considered. So I'm not looking at the full game. I'm only looking at the last 2 minutes of the fourth quarter overtime. So maybe that may lead to some selection bias in the data analysis results. So that's something we have to keep in mind when we're talking about how the crowd is going to affect the referee bias in NBA for my study. That's all I have here. Thank you so much. I'm open for questions that you may have.
Thank you, Hua. Great job, great presentation. We have some questions coming in. We only have a few minutes, so I'm just going to go through a couple of them quickly. First is a look at the 2-minute report. The question was, who reviews these decisions? And in other words, is it a decision of one reviewer? Is it possible that that reviewer is wrong? So who does the decisions on the 2-minute report?
Well, the NBA officials, they have, NBA office, they have a group of senior officials. So they're going to sit together and review every single play in the last 2 minutes of the fourth quarter overtime, and they're going to make those collective decisions on whether this call can be considered as incorrect non-calls or incorrect calls. So there's a group of people, senior officials, make those kind of decisions.
One quick note, because I failed to mention this when I introduced Dr. Gong from the start. Before he became a professor, he worked for the New York Knicks in their analytics department. So the NBA is partially part of his specialty. Last question says, thank you for the excellent lecture. Should pro basketball leagues employ gambling experts that monitor games in real time to closely monitor unusual officiating patterns that could be tied to match fixing? What needs to be done from a surveillance and integrity standpoint to prevent a scandal involving referee manipulation of foul calls?
Well, I think they can definitely do so to employ this gambling expert to monitor some very unusual patterns in gambling activities. But I think, overall, zooming back a little bit, I think the reason we want to understand those kind of referee bias in the NBA is because we want to make sure that those unusual gambling activity is not caused by the referee bias. Maybe it's caused by some gamblers are trying to take advantage of something in the games. So we have to make sure, we have to be very clear what kind of unusual activity is caused by the referee bias, or are the referees are trying to purposely fix games or not. That's why we need to study those kind of referee bias in NBA. But going back to your question, I think they can definitely hire those gambling experts to monitor some unusual activities in the betting market.
Thank you, Hua. Great presentation.